Welcome back, everyone. Peach's funeral should have been a moment of mourning, a day drenched in sorrow and heavy farewells. But from the very first moment, the atmosphere at Fairmont Crest carried a completely different color, cold, warped, and filled with an unease so sharp it felt as if this place was not merely burying a dead woman, but trying to bury a far more dangerous truth with her. The white flowers were arranged perfectly, the black clothing was immaculate, and every face seemed carefully composed into an appropriate expression of grief. Yet the longer anyone looked, the more obvious it became that something was deeply out of place. No one was truly relaxed. No one truly believed in that silence. And within that silence, polished too carefully to be natural, two disturbing irregularities emerged so clearly that they could not be ignored, turning Peach's funeral into the spark for an even greater explosion. The first thing that drew every eye to Leslie was not sorrow, but the suffocating tension written all over her face. Leslie did not look like a woman who had come to say goodbye to someone who had just died. She looked like someone stepping into a room rigged with explosives, struggling to control her breathing, measuring every gaze around her, trying to guess who knew what, who suspected something, and who would be the first to rip apart the veil she had worked so hard to keep in place. Every time someone approached her, her shoulders stiffened. Every time she heard a whisper, her eyes shifted with raw panic, as if she feared her name might be the next thing spoken aloud. That pressure, forced down so hard it had nowhere left to go, made her seem utterly out of place among the sea of black mourning clothes. People began to realize that Leslie was not grieving in any recognizable way. Her greatest fear that day was not lying inside the flower-covered coffin. It was the possibility that some secret would rise to the surface alongside Peach's death. The second disturbing detail was even more chilling, because it did not come from one person alone, but from the entire atmosphere surrounding Peach's death. Each sign was small, but together they created a pattern cold enough to shake everyone. The way some people avoided looking directly at one another, the way a few faces seemed to stunned, while others were calm in a way that felt rehearsed. The way words of comfort sounded less like sympathy and more like veiled attempts to study each other's reactions. Peach's death had been announced as a heartbreaking tragedy, a shocking loss that left everyone devastated. But the longer people remained there, the more it felt as though everything had been arranged in advance. Not only the death itself, but the way everyone had prepared for the questions that would follow it. The funeral no longer felt like a place of remembrance. It became a stage for suspicion, where every gesture could be read as a sign, and every glance felt like an accusation that had not yet found its voice. From that moment on, the first cracks in Fairmont Crest's polished illusion began to show. Leslie understood better than anyone that she was no longer standing in a safe place. Peach's death, which might once have seemed like the end of a problem, was beginning to look like the beginning of something even more dangerous. What had Peaches taken with her into the grave? And before she died, how much had she known? Whom had she told? And what had she left behind? Those were the real questions tightening around Leslie's throat. Her anger was not born only of suspicion. It was fueled by the fact that the entire situation was slipping beyond her control. Everything she had built through calculation, manipulation, and silence was now under threat from the one thing she could no longer reshape. A dead woman always leaves behind an empty space for the living to fill with fear and theory. That anger in Leslie did not explode outward in a loud, obvious way. It simmered under the surface, poisonous and increasingly dangerous. She began to see every person at the funeral as a potential threat. Each mourner who stepped closer to the coffin, each gaze that lingered too long on her face, each hand laid gently on her arm in comfort made her feel as though she was being backed farther and farther into a corner. But beneath her fear of exposure was something deeper and crueler, a bitter fury that Peaches had died at exactly the wrong time. If Peaches had still been alive, Leslie might have been able to manipulate her, pressure her, silence her, redirect her. The living can still be controlled, the dead cannot. Peaches' death, instead of extinguishing the danger, had made everything far more unstable, because now anyone could build a theory, and every theory had the power to drag Leslie into ruin. Meanwhile, the people around her could no longer maintain the restraint they had brought with them. The pain of losing Peaches quickly became infected by the growing sense that they had all been deceived. Some began to remember small details that once seemed meaningless. Leslie's strange attitude in the final days, the subtle shifts in Peaches' behavior before her death, as if she had discovered something but had not lived long enough to put it into words. Grief gradually transformed into anger at the possibility that her death had not been simple at all. And once grief merges with suspicion, it stops producing tears and begins producing hostility. Fairmont Crest started to shift from a place of mourning into a battleground of theories, where every person struggled to piece together scattered fragments of memory in hopes of finding the truth. Even if doing so meant destroying bonds once believed to be unbreakable, Leslie felt that shift with brutal clarity. She was no longer afraid only that the truth would come out. She was terrified of losing control over the story she had silently shaped. In her mind, everything tightened into a pure survival war. If she stayed silent, suspicion would deepen. If she reacted too strongly, she would look even guiltier. If she tried to crush the questions, she would only make them burn hotter. That trap made her harder, harsher, and more extreme. Fear made her rigid, but anger made her dangerous. She began to see every expression of sympathy as false, every condolence as a disguised probe, every glance as a verdict waiting to be spoken. The more cornered she felt, the more ruthless she became. She was no longer simply trying to protect herself. She was reaching the point where she might be willing to do anything to avoid being dragged down. The cruelest part of all was that Peaches' death did not merely threaten to reveal a hidden truth. It also exposed fractures in the hearts of the people who had once believed they understood one another. The loss should have drawn them closer in shared grief, but instead it pulled hidden distrust to the surface. Those who had once trusted Leslie began to waver. Those who had already doubted her found even more reason to dig deeper. And Leslie herself, through her panic, slowly turned into the center of every suspicion. She was no longer a grieving woman trying to survive a shock. She became the living embodiment of a single terrible question. What exactly was she trying to protect? Or more frightening still, what exactly was she trying to bury alongside Peaches? From there, the funeral stopped being an ending and became the starting point for a new chain of disasters. Secrets once buried tightly began to seep through the smallest cracks. Something that had gone missing suddenly reappeared. A memory once dismissed as vague became sharp and undeniable. Someone who had stayed silent for too long began to refuse silence any longer. There did not need to be a full confession. All it would take was enough mismatched details, enough reactions that did not fit, enough fear leaking through supposedly private moments, and the entire picture would assemble itself into a truth no one could deny. And when that happened, Leslie would not only have to face questions about Peach's death, she would also have to face every wound, every resentment, every betrayal she had quietly caused long before this funeral ever began. Fairmont Crest had always lived with hidden tensions beneath its polished surface, but this had gone far beyond an ordinary power struggle. Because when a death becomes the catalyst for a buried truth, no one remains safe. Leslie knew that, and it was precisely that knowledge that made her more dangerous than ever. A woman furious because she was losing control, terrified because her secret was nearing exposure, and desperate because she knew that one final piece, falling into the right place, could bring down everything she had built. Would not react in ordinary ways. She would resist, conceal, lash out, and perhaps even pull others down with her if she had to. That is what makes Peach's death more than a tragedy. It is quietly becoming the beginning of a chain explosion capable of burning through every relationship, every loyalty, and every carefully worn mask in Fairmont Crest. And when the final secret is dragged into the light, the pain will no longer belong only to the woman in the coffin. It will belong to every person who stood around that casket that day, believing they had come to witness an ending, when in truth, they were standing at the birth of a far larger nightmare. Thank you all for staying and watching the full video. Please like and subscribe to our channel so you can get the latest updates.